Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. It's the 1800s. There's no GPS, no smartphones, no emergency hotlines. You're alone in the vast wilderness, surrounded by towering trees, unfamiliar sounds, and an uncertain path ahead. Survival isn't just a skill, it's a way of life. In the 19th century, pioneers, trappers, and explorers had to rely on grit, knowledge, and instinct to stay alive. Today, I'll share 10 essential survival tips from the 1800s, time-tested methods that helped people not just survive, but thrive in the wild. In the 1800s, fire wasn't just a convenience. It was a necessity for staying alive. Matches were rare and unreliable, especially in wet conditions, so most frontiersmen, trappers, and explorers relied on flint and steel as their primary fire-starting tools. These small, portable items were easy to carry and incredibly dependable if you knew how to use them properly. A piece of flint, a hard, quartz-like rock, was struck against high-carbon steel, creating sparks. Those sparks needed to land on a tinder bundle, often made from dry grass, shredded bark, or char cloth, which was a piece of linen or cotton that had been scorched without catching fire. Once the tinder caught, it was gently blown into flame and transferred to kindling and then larger logs. But it wasn't just about making fire. It was about making it quickly and reliably, often under pressure. Imagine a sudden cold front, heavy rain, or even predators nearby. The ability to create fire on command could be the only thing standing between safety and serious danger. It could dry wet clothes, boil questionable water, cook meat, and signal for help, or ward off wolves, bears, and other nighttime threats. For people in the 19th century wilderness, a fire was a symbol of control and comfort. It kept the wild at bay, even if just for a night. So they often practiced starting fires daily, even when it wasn't urgently needed, just to sharpen the skill. It wasn't just about tools, it was about technique, patience, and consistency. Many even carried multiple types of tinder in waterproof containers, knowing that in the wilderness, even a single spark could be a matter of life and death. And while today we may have lighters and fire starters, back then, mastering flint and steel was as important as knowing how to breathe. In the untamed wilderness of the 1800s, food wasn't something you could count on finding in a neat package. There were no supermarkets, no preserved meals, and often, hunting wasn't a daily guarantee. That's why deep knowledge of wild plants, both edible and poisonous, was one of the most vital survival skills a person could have. Back then, people learned from experience, mentors, or handwritten journals passed down through generations. They memorized the shape, color, texture, and even the seasonal behavior of plants to determine whether something could be eaten or not. Mistaking a toxic plant for an edible one could lead to severe illness, hallucinations, paralysis, or death. For example, they knew that wild berries could be either life-saving or lethal. Blueberries, blackberries, and elderberries were generally safe, while berries from plants like deadly nightshade or baneberry were fatal. They also identified edible greens like dandelion leaves, plantain, and lamb's quarters, all of which provided essential nutrients like iron and vitamin C, vital in the absence of meat or preserved food. Roots and tubers were another source of sustenance. Wild onions and cattail roots were safe if properly prepared, while others like water hemlock could kill within hours. Even mushrooms were approached with extreme caution. Most survivalists of the era would avoid them altogether unless they had specialized knowledge, knowing that one wrong bite could be the end. Aside from nutrition, many plants served medicinal purposes. For instance, willow bark was chewed or brewed into tea to relieve pain. It contained salicin, the natural compound later used to create aspirin. Yarrow was used to stop bleeding, while mint helped with digestion. The ability to distinguish between helpful and harmful flora didn't just come from books. It came from direct interaction with the land. People in the 1800s would often test new plants by applying them to the skin or lips first, waiting for reactions before consuming even a small bite. This cautious, respectful approach to nature ensured they didn't just survive, but could actually sustain themselves when no other food was available. In a time when every step off the beaten path could lead into unfamiliar territory, plants were both pharmacy and pantry. The forest floor wasn't just dirt and leaves. It was a complex, living source of nutrition, healing, and danger, and those who survived knew how to read it like a book. In the 1800s, surviving in the wilderness wasn't just about finding food or water. It was also about avoiding the brutal consequences of nature. And nothing reminded people of nature's raw power more than the cold, unpredictable night. That's why one of the unspoken rules for frontiersmen, trappers, and explorers was simple. Always build your shelter before the sun goes down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, temperatures could drop dramatically, even in warmer climates. Without proper shelter, a person could face hypothermia, frostbite, or be exposed to biting winds, rain, or even snow. And in heavily wooded or mountainous areas, nights came quickly, cutting visibility and making construction of any kind nearly impossible. Pioneers of the 1800s didn't have tents or modern sleeping bags. What they had were natural resources and hand tools, maybe a hatchet, some rope, and the knowledge passed down through experience. They learned to use what the environment gave them. Fallen trees, large rocks, and even caves could become part of a solid shelter if approached with skill. They constructed lean-tos from branches and bark, used moss and leaves for insulation, and always oriented their shelter away from prevailing winds. When possible, they built near a water source, but not too close, knowing that low-lying areas could flood or become dangerously cold at night. Time management was key. As daylight faded, even a 15-minute delay could mean finishing a shelter in darkness, and that often meant no protection at all. So wilderness survivors made it a rule to start looking for shelter materials at least 2 to 3 hours before sunset, giving themselves ample time to gather, build, and prepare a fire. And it wasn't just about protection from the weather. A good shelter offered safety from wild animals. Wolves, mountain lions, bears, many predators were more active at night. A well-constructed shelter, especially one with a fire nearby, created a physical and psychological barrier between the person and the untamed wild. Insects were also a concern. Mosquitoes in warmer regions could carry disease, and ticks were a constant nuisance. Wilderness survivors would often elevate their bedding off the ground using logs or rocks, and burn certain herbs or woods, like pine or sage, to keep insects at bay. The wisdom of the 1800s wasn't built on convenience, but on necessity. Those who made it through the night comfortably were the ones who respected the rhythm of the land, and understood that when it came to shelter, being early wasn't just smart. It was essential. In the vast, untamed wilderness of the 1800s, few things were more critical than finding a source of water. A person could survive weeks without food, but only a few days without water, and even less if they were exerting themselves in rugged terrain or under a harsh sun. That's why one of the first instincts of any seasoned frontiersman, fur trapper, or lone traveler was to search for water, rivers, creeks, springs, or even dew collected from leaves. But just finding water wasn't enough. What many didn't realize, until it was too late, was that not all water was safe to drink. Back then, the concept of bacteria was still not widely understood. Germ theory was just beginning to gain traction, and while people didn't know the scientific reasons behind waterborne illness, they absolutely knew the consequences. Diarrhea, vomiting, fevers, and in many tragic cases, death, followed the consumption of contaminated water. Wilderness travelers learned through bitter experience that a clear stream could still be deadly. So, they developed and passed on methods to purify water before drinking it, especially when far from civilization. The most trusted method was boiling. Even in the most remote areas, those who valued their survival always carried a small metal pot or kettle. They'd collect water, start a fire using flint and steel, and bring the liquid to a rolling boil for several minutes. This simple act destroyed many of the harmful organisms lurking unseen. Boiling was time-consuming and required both firewood and patience, but it was far better than the alternative: agonizing illness in the middle of nowhere with no one to help. Aside from boiling, they sometimes used natural filtration methods. Travelers would pour water through layers of cloth, sand, charcoal, or even moss to remove sediment and improve taste. While not always enough to kill microbes, these methods helped filter out visible dirt and insects, especially in stagnant or muddy pools. Experienced survivalists also knew how to read the water. Fast-moving streams, especially those close to a spring or high in the mountains, were considered safer than still ponds or marshy swamps, where bacteria and parasites thrived. They avoided water that smelled foul, had a strange film on the surface, or was found near dead animals or animal tracks. The wilderness taught them to observe and listen. If the wildlife avoided a particular water source, chances were humans should too. In areas where boiling wasn't an immediate option, like during travel, some carried pieces of cloth or felt to strain water quickly in emergencies. Others chewed on roots like licorice or sassafras to stay hydrated when water was scarce, as some roots contained moisture and mild purifying properties. Rainwater, when collected in clean containers or from large leaves, was also considered safe and even refreshing. Water wasn't just for drinking. It was needed for cooking, treating wounds, washing tools, and maintaining basic hygiene, all crucial for preventing infections and illness. So knowing where to find water, how to access it, and how to make it safe became one of the most reliable survival instincts a person could develop. And when no fresh water was in sight, the old-time wilderness explorers would often dig into sandy riverbeds or dry creek beds in search of underground moisture. The sand acted as a natural filter, and with enough depth, they could create small wells where cleaner water would slowly seep through. In the wilderness of the 1800s, the idea of catching your next meal wasn't a hobby or something done for sport. It was a daily necessity, a matter of survival that required constant attention, patience, and skill. For those who ventured deep into the forests, across the mountains, or into the vast frontier, trapping and fishing weren't occasional luxuries. They were essential parts of everyday life. A successful catch could mean the difference between strength and starvation. Survivalists of that era quickly learned that large game couldn't be relied upon every day. Hunting deer, elk, or wild boar required significant energy, time, and often luck. These animals moved in patterns, were easily spooked, and might not appear when needed most. Instead, the smart survivor turned to the smaller, more reliable sources of protein: rabbits, squirrels, beavers, muskrats, birds, and fish. These were the lifeline, and mastering how to catch them with minimal tools became one of the most valuable skills anyone could develop. Trapping was often done using handcrafted tools made from natural materials or simple metal components carried along the journey. Snare traps made from twine, sinew, or even vines were placed along game trails, near burrows, or water sources where animals regularly passed through. The traps were designed to tighten around the animal's neck or legs, ensuring a clean catch without the need for constant supervision. Survivalists placed multiple traps each day, understanding that not everyone would result in a catch. It was a numbers game. The more traps set, the better the odds. They studied animal behavior, learned to hide their scent, and often used bait like nuts, berries, or bits of meat to attract prey. Checking the traps became part of a daily routine, often done in the early morning or just before dusk. Fishing, too, was a crucial survival method. Rivers, lakes, and streams offered an abundance of food if you knew where and how to look. People of the 1800s made use of everything they had: carved bone hooks, sinew fishing lines, sharpened sticks for spearing, and woven baskets for trapping fish in shallow pools. In many cases, they used passive methods such as setting up fish weirs, barriers made of rocks or sticks that guided fish into a trap, which allowed them to catch fish even while working on other tasks. Unlike hunting, which burned calories and took time, fishing and trapping worked in the background. They allowed the survivor to multitask, gather firewood, repair gear, build shelter, all while their traps and lines did the work for them. This balance of effort and reward made them indispensable techniques in long-term survival. Moreover, these methods provided more than just meat. Animal hides were dried and used for clothing, shelter, and trade. Bones became tools, needles, or even weapons. Fat from animals was rendered down into tallow for cooking or making candles. Nothing went to waste, and every successful trap or catch was a valuable resource that extended far beyond the dinner plate. Trapping and fishing were also about understanding patterns and patience. A person had to know when certain animals were most active, how water levels affected fish movement, and how the seasons changed availability. In winter, for example, trapping small game became even more vital, as many fish were harder to access under frozen rivers and lakes. Survivors learned to adjust, setting traps along snow trails, baiting heavily, and using more insulation to preserve what they caught. These daily skills were as routine as building a fire or boiling water. They were practiced, perfected, and passed down like sacred knowledge. Because in the wild, where food didn't come from a store but from the land itself, knowing how to trap and fish was not just helpful. It was life. In the 1800s wilderness, fire wasn't just a tool. It was the very heartbeat of survival. It provided warmth on frigid nights, light in total darkness, a means to cook food and purify water, and protection against predators. Without it, a lone traveler or frontiersman was left vulnerable to the full, raw force of nature. That's why anyone who dared to venture alone into the vast forests, rugged mountains, or open plains had to master the art of starting a fire in any condition, no matter the weather. Starting a fire might seem simple today with modern lighters and matches, but in the 1800s, the process was a skill that required patience, practice, and preparation. Most travelers carried a flint and steel kit, two simple tools that, when struck together, produced sparks. Those sparks needed to fall into a bundle of dry tinder, a fragile, flammable material such as dry moss, birch bark, cotton cloth, or finely shredded wood. With careful breath and the right angle, a small ember would ignite and slowly grow into a flame. From there, dry twigs were added, then sticks, and eventually larger logs. But what if everything was wet? What if it had been raining for days, or snow had blanketed the forest floor? That's where the true survivors separated themselves from the rest. They learned how to find dry materials even in soaked environments. They'd peel bark from the inside of dead trees, split logs to access dry cores, or collect pitch from pine trees, which burned hot even when damp. They often carried a small pouch of dry tinder in their clothing, a precious reserve guarded from the elements, knowing that it could save their life if firewood was scarce or wet. The wise understood that fire needed shelter too. In storms or heavy wind, fires were built in depressions, behind natural windbreaks, or even under makeshift shelters made of bark, stones, or branches. They constructed fire lays, careful arrangements of wood and kindling designed to ignite easily and burn long. The teepee lay, log cabin lay, and lean-to lay were some of the classic structures used by woodsmen who needed a flame that would last through the night. And fire had many more uses than just heat or cooking. The smoke kept away mosquitoes and biting insects. The light gave people a sense of security and allowed them to work or prepare gear after sundown. Fire was used to signal for help, to harden spear tips, to cook medicinal herbs, and even to boil down tree sap for natural syrup or glue. It was also critical for making char cloth, a special material made by burning cotton in a sealed container, which made it catch fire instantly with even the smallest spark. For someone surviving alone, especially over long stretches, fire also had a psychological purpose. It provided companionship in an otherwise silent and empty world. The flickering flames gave warmth not just to the body but also to the spirit, easing fear, calming nerves, and marking the boundary between the self and the surrounding wild. Fire was a reminder of human presence, of control, of comfort, of hope. Rain, snow, or wind could never be an excuse. If a person couldn't start a fire under stress or in bad weather, they simply weren't ready for the challenges of the wild. That's why seasoned frontiersmen practiced constantly, developing techniques to spark a flame with cold hands, in complete darkness or under duress. They knew how to read the wood, determine its burn quality by feel and sound, and judge when a fire needed more oxygen or more fuel. They also understood fire's danger. Uncontrolled, it could destroy entire forests or consume a shelter in moments. That's why fires were never left unattended. Ashes were buried, embers extinguished with water and earth, and campsites carefully cleaned to avoid unintentional blazes. Respecting fire was as important as depending on it. In the untamed wilderness of the 1800s, there were no GPS devices, no cell phones, and often no detailed maps for the remote regions that travelers dared to explore. Survival meant not only staying alive day to day, but also knowing where you were, where you came from, and where you were headed, all without the help of modern navigation tools. That's why mastering natural navigation was one of the most vital skills for anyone attempting to survive alone in the wild. The sun was a trustworthy guide by day. Survivors of the era used its position to determine direction. They knew that in the northern hemisphere, the sun rose roughly in the east and set in the west. Around midday, it was due south, casting the shortest shadows of the day. By simply observing the sun's arc and the shadows it cast, experienced travelers could determine cardinal directions with surprising accuracy. They might plant a stick in the ground and mark its shadow, then observe its movement over time to draw an east-west line. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, their eyes turned upward. The night sky was their compass. The North Star, or Polaris, held a fixed position in the sky, pointing true north. For generations, it served as a beacon for lost souls, traders, and trappers making their way through dense forests or across open plains. They would look for the Big Dipper and follow the pointer stars at its edge, which always led straight to Polaris. Unlike the planets and other stars that moved in the night sky, Polaris remained still, providing a constant reference point in a shifting world. Survivors also relied heavily on landmarks and topography. They paid close attention to mountain ranges, rivers, oddly shaped trees, cliffs, and rock formations, using them as waypoints to keep track of their location. A bent tree, a waterfall, a split boulder. Any of these could become critical navigational markers, etched into the memory of the traveler and recalled as they retraced their steps or sought to chart a new course. This method of navigation wasn't just visual, it was deeply sensory. The sound of a river, the smell of pine, or the feel of moss underfoot all played a role in orienting oneself within the landscape. Memory, in fact, was one of the most powerful tools. Lone explorers in the 1800s would mentally map the terrain as they traveled, recalling distances between points, changes in elevation, and the angle of the sun at certain hours. They developed an almost photographic memory of paths and patterns, often using rhythm and repetition to retain information. Some created songs or verbal cues to help remember turns, hazards, or routes. Losing one's sense of direction in those days could be catastrophic, so these methods weren't just clever, they were necessary. Additionally, many survivalists used natural indicators to stay oriented. Moss was often believed to grow more heavily on the north side of trees, especially in dense forests, though this wasn't always reliable. Still, when combined with other cues, it could help confirm direction. Wind patterns, animal behavior, and even the way certain plants grew in relation to sunlight were all subtle signs that guided the observant traveler. Waterways were often treated like natural highways. Following a river downstream could lead to larger bodies of water and ultimately to settlements. Many frontiersmen would travel along rivers not just for access to water and food, but because rivers provided a reliable navigational route through the wild. In some territories, entire survival strategies were built around staying close to a single watercourse. What's remarkable is how much of this navigation was done by instinct honed through repetition and experience. After months or years in the wilderness, the best survivors developed an almost sixth sense, an ability to sense direction even in unfamiliar terrain. They knew how to avoid walking in circles, how to compensate for uneven landscapes, and how to retrace their path even after days of travel. In the 1800s, a shelter wasn't just a place of rest or comfort. It was a crucial survival tool. The wilderness could be brutal, with fierce storms, freezing temperatures, or the intense heat of the midday sun. The ability to quickly build a shelter that provided warmth, protection, and security was essential for anyone trying to survive alone in the wild. Without proper shelter, exposure to the elements could lead to hypothermia, dehydration, or even death. When survivalists set out into the wilderness, they didn't wait until dark or until the weather turned bad to think about shelter. They understood that time was precious, and building a shelter was one of the first tasks that needed to be accomplished each day, especially when traveling long distances or when the weather was unpredictable. The first step in creating shelter was choosing the right location. Survivors would look for natural windbreaks, such as dense thickets of trees, rock formations, or even the side of a hill that could offer some protection from the elements. The ground was another important consideration. It was vital to build the shelter on high ground, away from the risk of flooding or pooling water, while also ensuring that the site had access to dry materials for the construction. Once the site was chosen, it was time to gather resources. In the 1800s, the most common shelters were lean-tos, A-frame structures, and debris huts, all of which could be constructed quickly using natural materials found in the environment. The materials used were often branches, leaves, bark, pine needles, and even animal hides. A lean-to, for example, could be built by leaning a sturdy branch against a tree and then layering smaller twigs and branches over the top to create a slanted roof. For added warmth, the inside could be lined with layers of pine boughs or grass, which also served to provide insulation against the cold. The A-frame shelter was another popular design. It involved gathering two long, straight branches to form a peak and then layering smaller branches across to create a roof. This structure was incredibly stable and could be easily adapted to fit the size of the group or the needs of the individual. While it was efficient in the summer months, in colder weather, an A-frame would require a thicker layer of insulating material, such as bark or snow, to keep the warmth in. In colder regions, the debris hut was an effective method of shelter. These were low, dome-shaped structures made by creating a frame with branches and then covering the frame with a thick layer of debris like leaves, grasses, moss, and even snow. The thicker the debris, the better the insulation. These huts were incredibly effective in keeping the cold out, and they retained body heat well, but they also required a great deal of time and effort to build properly. A fire was often incorporated into the shelter construction, either by placing it just outside the entrance or within a small stone circle inside the shelter itself. The fire helped to ward off the chill of the night, provide light, and keep wild animals at bay. Many survivors also used the smoke from the fire to help deter mosquitoes and other insects, especially during the summer months. However, keeping a fire burning inside a shelter was a delicate balance. as ventilation was crucial to prevent suffocation from smoke. In addition to providing warmth and shelter from the wind and rain, these shelters were also essential for protecting from wild animals. In the wilderness, the threat of predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions was ever present. The walls of a shelter, combined with a well-constructed fire, offered a strong line of defense. In more extreme cases, survivors would create makeshift weapons such as spears, knives, or even sharpened sticks, which could be used to defend against predators or in an emergency. Moreover, shelter was not just a physical barrier. It also played a key role in emotional and mental survival. Being alone in the wilderness, often far from civilization, could be mentally taxing. A shelter provided not only protection from the harsh elements, but also a sense of security and privacy. It was a place to rest, reflect, and regroup, offering the chance to sleep without the constant threat of exposure or attack. In extreme weather, such as snowstorms, the survivors understood that shelter alone might not be enough. They often dug into the snow, creating igloo-like structures that would provide both insulation and stability. The snow cave was incredibly efficient in these conditions, maintaining a constant, relatively warm temperature inside due to the insulating properties of the snow. Even though it might seem cold to us today, snow shelters often remained warmer than the outside air, making them an invaluable survival tool in extreme winter conditions. Finally, for those who traveled long distances or had to move frequently, shelter wasn't always permanent. In such cases, temporary shelters made of canvas tarps or bivouac shelters became essential. These lightweight, easily assembled shelters were used in combination with basic tools like ropes, stakes, and fire-starting kits, enabling travelers to set up a safe haven in just a few minutes. In the 1800s, a person's survival in the wilderness wasn't just reliant on physical strength or basic tools. It also depended heavily on knowledge of the land, the wildlife, and perhaps most critically, the plants and medicinal herbs that could be found in nature. A deep understanding of plant life and how to use it for food, medicine, or even survival was an invaluable skill that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Survivors knew that not all plants were safe to eat. Some plants were toxic or could cause severe illness if ingested. In fact, the number of poisonous plants in the wild could be overwhelming, and knowing which ones to avoid was just as important as knowing which ones were safe. For example, plants like hemlock or poison ivy were often mistaken for edible species, but consuming them could lead to a painful death or severe allergic reactions. Mastering plant identification was thus essential for safe foraging and understanding which plants could provide nourishment and medicine. On the flip side, there were countless plants that offered sustenance and healing properties. The key was recognizing them in different seasons, as some plants were edible only in certain stages of their growth. Berries, such as raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries, were a common food source. They were rich in nutrients and could be eaten fresh or preserved for later. Other fruits, like wild apples, cherries, and plums, were also found in abundance across various regions, providing a much-needed burst of vitamins, especially vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy on long journeys or during harsh winters. Root vegetables were another staple in many regions. Wild potatoes and sunchokes could be dug up for food, and dandelion roots were a common source of sustenance, especially when other food sources were scarce. The leaves of the dandelion plant were also edible and could be used in salads or boiled as greens, offering additional nutrition. Other plants like clover and nettle could be cooked and eaten, providing vital protein and iron. Beyond basic food sources, medicinal plants played a critical role in wilderness survival. In the absence of pharmacies or modern medicine, frontiersmen and travelers relied on plants to treat everything from minor wounds to severe infections. For example, willow bark was a natural pain reliever and was often used as a substitute for aspirin. It contains salicin, which the body converts into salicylic acid, the active compound in modern aspirin. Willow bark could be chewed or steeped in water to create a pain-relieving tea. Echinacea, also known as coneflower, was used to boost the immune system, while golden seal was employed to treat a range of ailments, from digestive issues to infections. Yarrow was another essential herb, as it was used to stop bleeding and promote healing in wounds. The leaves could be crushed and applied directly to the injury, acting as a natural antiseptic. Another important plant was plantain, a common herb found along paths and roadsides. Plantain leaves were often used to treat insect stings, minor burns, and wounds by applying the crushed leaves directly to the affected area. The leaves helped reduce inflammation and speed up the healing process. Travelers also relied on tree sap for medicinal purposes. The sap from pine trees, for example, was used to treat coughs and colds, as it contains compounds that have soothing properties. Pine needles were also used to make a vitamin C-rich tea, which was invaluable for maintaining health during long, hard winters when fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce. In addition to medicinal uses, plants were also used for natural remedies to prevent or treat illnesses. Garlic was used as an antibacterial and antifungal agent, and sage was utilized for its soothing properties in cases of sore throat or digestive discomfort. Lavender, with its calming effects, was often used to treat anxiety, insomnia, and other stress-related issues that could arise from prolonged isolation in the wilderness. A traveler or survivalist also had to be highly cautious about preparing these plants correctly. For example, acorns, although abundant, needed to be leached of their tannins before they could be consumed, as tannins are toxic if ingested in large amounts. Similarly, pounded corn could be used as flour for baking, but the process of drying and grinding required knowledge of the proper techniques to avoid contamination and spoilage. Apart from medicinal plants, knowledge of poisonous plants and their antidotes was crucial. For example, foxglove was toxic if ingested, but had medicinal properties when used in small, controlled doses as a heart treatment. Such knowledge was passed down through generations, often through oral traditions or written guides passed along by early herbalists and settlers. Learning the properties of local plants was also vital for understanding how to preserve food for winter months. Some plants, such as juniper berries and cedar leaves, were used for preserving meat, while others, like elderberries, were made into syrups that could help treat coughs and colds during the colder months. The knowledge of plants also extended into making natural dyes for clothing, creating natural fibers for clothing and ropes, and crafting tools and medicines from tree bark, roots, and seeds. Plants were central not just for survival in terms of nutrition and healing, but for crafting everything from clothes to baskets, shelter insulation, and even making soaps and cleaning products. Surviving alone in the wilderness was not just about gathering food, building shelter, or knowing how to use plants for medicine. Mental resilience was equally crucial for survival. In the 1800s, frontiersmen, explorers, and other lone travelers often faced not just physical hardships, but also extreme isolation, the fear of predators, and the constant uncertainty of their environment. Maintaining a clear mind and strong willpower could mean the difference between survival and succumbing to despair. In those days, travelers were often far from civilization, isolated in the wilderness for months or even years at a time. Whether it was a trapper, a fur trader, a pioneer, or an adventurer, solitude was an inevitable part of their lives. The constant isolation could wear down the psyche, leading to feelings of loneliness, depression, and desperation. For those who had no companions, not only was the fear of the unknown a constant companion, but the boredom and sheer monotony of wilderness life could also take a toll. Time alone could stretch endlessly, and the lack of human interaction often made the mind play tricks. To combat this, survivors had to adopt practices that kept their minds sharp and focused. Routine became essential. In the absence of clocks, calendars, or modern devices, a well-established daily routine provided a sense of structure and purpose. The act of waking up early, gathering food, maintaining a shelter, and performing other necessary tasks offered stability and gave the day a sense of meaning. This repetitive structure was not just functional. It had a psychological benefit, keeping the mind engaged and preventing the paralysis of indecision. A lack of routine could quickly lead to procrastination, mental fatigue, and even apathy, all of which were dangerous in an environment where survival depended on being proactive. Mental endurance was often bolstered by what could be called mindful distraction. The wilderness provided an endless array of tasks to be done: building, repairing, gathering, and preparing. But many frontiersmen also turned to small personal rituals to maintain their mental equilibrium. Some would carve marks on trees or rocks, making a record of time passed or progress made. Others would keep journals or write letters, even if they had no intention of sending them, as a way to express their thoughts, reflect on their days, or record their challenges. This practice helped prevent the buildup of psychological pressure and created a sense of connection with the past and future, even if the traveler was physically isolated. In addition to routine, mental resilience was strengthened by hope and spirituality. Religious beliefs were a central aspect of many people's lives in the 1800s, and for many, the wilderness became a place of reflection, prayer, and personal growth. Some would turn to their faith for comfort, invoking prayers or religious rituals to guide them through difficult moments. Storytelling also played a significant role in mental resilience. Many travelers would recount stories of their past experiences or share legends and folklore with others they met along the way. These stories helped to maintain a sense of community, even in isolated environments, and provided an emotional outlet. They also created a sense of continuity, reminding survivors that they were part of something greater than themselves, a shared history of human struggle and survival. Connection with nature was another essential factor for maintaining mental resilience. While isolation was taxing, being surrounded by nature could also be therapeutic. The sound of a flowing river, the sight of a sunrise, or the fresh scent of pine trees. These sensory experiences provided a sense of calm and reminded the traveler of the beauty of life and the world around them. In some cases, these moments of connection with nature became a powerful antidote to loneliness and despair. The presence of wildlife, birds chirping, animals crossing the trail, also brought a sense of life and vibrancy, providing a sense of companionship in an otherwise empty environment. Many survivors also took pride in their self-sufficiency, which helped them maintain a sense of control in a world that could often feel uncontrollable. The knowledge that they could build a shelter, find food, and defend themselves in the wilderness fostered a deep sense of pride and confidence. Each day spent overcoming challenges reinforced their belief in their abilities. This self-reliance not only provided physical survival, but also fortified their mental well-being. The physical activities of survival, such as hunting, fishing, and foraging, were crucial for sustaining both the body and the mind. These activities required intense concentration and problem-solving, keeping the mind occupied and engaged. Hunting, for example, demanded patience, strategy, and skill, and the rewards of a successful hunt provided both physical nourishment and a sense of accomplishment. These small victories, whether in the form of food, a successful shelter, or a well-made tool, helped to create a positive feedback loop where the act of surviving in itself became a source of strength and motivation. Isolation, however, also brought with it deep psychological challenges. Some survivors reported experiencing hallucinations, vivid dreams, and distorted perceptions of time. In extreme cases, mental breakdowns could occur, often leading to what we now recognize as survivors' guilt, trauma, or even the complete collapse of mental faculties. These psychological conditions could render a person incapable of continuing their journey, especially if they had no support network or way of communicating with others. It's important to note that many of the mental challenges faced by travelers were compounded by the harshness of the environment itself. Whether it was extreme temperatures, rugged terrain, or harsh storms, nature could be an unrelenting adversary, and the constant physical strain could also wear down a person's psychological stamina. In such conditions, mental fortitude was not just a matter of individual willpower, but often a matter of surviving with purpose. Whether that purpose was returning home, finding a better life, or simply overcoming the relentless challenges posed by the wilderness itself.